Hi, everybody. I hope everything is going all right with you. This video here is not covering class material. This video is covering current events and politics. Those of you who have been attending my course, and according to my attendance book, most of you have been here at least most of the time, know that I like to talk about politics and current events in class, and I am not going to let coronavirus stop me. But this is a completely optional video. If you don't want to see it, don't worry about it. But I will note that my cat Rosie is currently underneath this table. So you may want to stay tuned because you never know, she might emerge out from under it and you would not want to miss that. I know my cat Frankie gave him a great hit after he photobombed my video on the Moodle discussion boards. One thing about coronavirus moving classes online is that every professor's cat is about to become famous. All right, coronavirus is messing up our politics, including messing up the presidential primaries. There was supposed to be a presidential primary in Ohio this past Tuesday, and it got postponed probably until June by the governor and the state health director, who decided that, well, packing people into elementary school gymnasiums to vote is probably something they shouldn't be doing if there's a pandemic going on. There were primaries held in Arizona, Illinois, and Florida still, and Joe Biden won big in all three primaries. His lead over Bernie Sanders is over 300 delegates. In order for Bernie to win the Democratic nomination, he would have to win 64% of the remaining delegates, meaning that Bernie, whose only big win the past month has been California, would have to win every single state by a gigantic margin in order to actually overcome Biden and win the nomination. If Bernie won every single state with 55% of the vote left to go, he would lose. Oh, and by the way, look who has emerged from underneath the table. Good girl, Rosie. Good kitty cat. All right. All right. Well, anybody who was just watching the video to see if Rosie came out is now free to go. All right. So yeah, at this point, Bernie is pretty much finished. We can call Joe Biden the presumptive Democratic nominee for president. I do want to note what an amazing comeback this has been for Joe Biden. He finished 5th in the New Hampshire primary. And believe it or not, I struggled to believe this. That was last month. That's all it was, a month ago. Joe Biden finished 5th in New Hampshire. And now he's pretty much secured the Democratic nomination for president. That is an amazing comeback. Good girl, Rosie. That is very, very impressive. Biden is now doing all the things you would expect a Democratic nominee to do in this situation. He is saying very nice things about Bernie in order to reconcile Bernie's supporters with Biden's victory. He is pivoting towards a general election. He has been very harsh in his criticism of President Trump's response to coronavirus. And he has also started causing speculation about his running mate. Joe Biden has announced his vice presidential nominee will be a woman. Names to look out for are Senator Klobuchar of Minnesota, who endorsed Biden before Super Tuesday and probably helped him win that state in the primary and could help secure him in the Midwest. Senator Kamala Harris of California, who also ran against Joe Biden. Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, who amazingly did not run for the Democratic nomination for president, even though it seems sometimes like half the Democrats in the Senate were running. Baldwin did not. Senator Tammy Duckworth of Illinois, who is a military veteran and was actually disabled while in the military fighting for the United States. So there are plenty of choices for Joe Biden. Now, we do not know how coronavirus is going to impact the general election this November. We know that in times of crisis, the public tends to rally around the president, and then the president's approval just starts to drop after a while once the crisis isn't immediately resolved. But none of those crises we're talking about were pandemics. We know the president's approval rating goes down when the economy is bad, when the economy enters into a recession, which we are. That presidents tend to lose re-election when that happens. But political scientists have never studied that when there was a pandemic, because well, fortunately, there were no cases for us to study. The last cases would have been in the 19th century, and there were no political scientists around to study it. So we will have to see. One thing that is interesting is that 4 senators have gotten themselves into hot water and an ethics investigation over allegations of insider trading from coronavirus. Basically, these senators were receiving intelligence briefings back in February and even January about coronavirus and the impact that it could have on the United States. Well, 4 senators who were definitely privy to that information, Senator Burr of North Carolina, Senator Einhoff of Oklahoma, Senator Kelly Loeffler or Loeffler, she's new, I'm not entirely sure on the pronunciation of her last name. Republicans are accused of insider trading, as is Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, all accused of insider trading. Senator Loeffler of Georgia is a particularly interesting case because she was appointed to the Senate to fill a vacancy back in January, and it's March, and she's under a serious ethics investigation. 3 months in the Senate and already under a serious ethics investigation that could result in you leaving the Senate. That has got to be a record. So what happened in all these cases is after getting briefings on the dangers of coronavirus and what it could do to the American economy, these senators sold a lot of stock, right? Now, it's possible there is an innocent explanation, but it definitely looks suspicious. In the case of Senator Loeffler, for example, she sold $3 million worth of stock, but then bought stock in a company that does telecommunications, i.e. a company that sells software that helps people work from their homes. She put money into that company after being briefed on coronavirus. Basically, she put her money into the one stock that is actually improving during this pandemic. That is mildly suspicious. All right. Well, those of you who know me know that I love to talk about old-timey politics, hence why I'm sitting in a rocking chair. I figure if I'm going to talk about old-timey politics, I should sit in a rocking chair. This pandemic is being compared to the Spanish flu of 1918, which is somewhat unfair only on the grounds that, believe it or not, the Spanish flu was way worse than this. This is really bad. The Spanish flu was worse. What's interesting is that, of course, the president is now being criticized in some circles for referring to coronavirus as the Chinese virus, based on it originating in China. Interesting, the Spanish flu was called the Spanish flu, but the Spanish flu of 1918 didn't actually originate in Spain. It originated in Kansas. Yeah. So what happened was the United States was involved in World War I. And we had just entered the war, and we were training millions of soldiers in training camps. And that's where the flu began. Now, because we were at war, the United States government had imposed strict censorship on American journalists. There were things American journalists were not allowed to talk about without the government's permission. The government said, you can't talk about the flu because we were at war with the Germans, and we didn't want the Germans to know that our military training camps had stopped training soldiers because the soldiers were sick with the flu. We didn't want the Germans to know this. Now, so the flu pandemic does not get reported in the American media. Even as it's spreading to American cities, American newspapers are not allowed to discuss it. So unless this flu had actually reached your particular town or your particular neighborhood, you wouldn't necessarily have even known it was going on. Now, some of our soldiers, of course, were going overseas, and some of them were asymptomatic, meaning they weren't feeling sick yet when they got on the transports to go to Europe, but they did have the flu. And once they got to Europe, they, of course, transmitted it to, in this case, the French and then the British, right? So the French and British armies were now heavily down with the flu. Well, the French and British governments were also imposing strict censorship, and they didn't want the Germans to know that at this point, the American army, the French army, and the British army are suffering serious losses due to the flu. Because if the Germans knew that, they could realize that they temporarily had a numerical advantage and they could go on the attack. So the flu eventually reached Spain. Spain was neutral. They were not involved in World War I. So they were not doing censorship of the press. The Spanish media was allowed to talk about what they wanted, and because Spain wasn't at war, the big news, of course, was the flu ravaging the country and killing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people in Spain. Now, the American media was not allowed to report on the flu pandemic in the United States, but they were allowed to report on the flu pandemic in Spain. So press reports began to appear in the US media about the flu ravaging Spain. And thus people started to get the impression that, oh, there's a terrible flu in Spain. Not here, of course, but in Spain. And thus began to think of it as the Spanish flu, even though, again, the flu actually originated in Kansas. Okay, tell you what, guys, next time I do this, next weekend, so send me some questions and I'll be happy to answer them in my next video. Until then, stay healthy, have a good one, and have an excellent week.